This event took place at Wimbledon BookFest 2023. The recordings are kindly sponsored by Bailey Gifford.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Simon Meir. I'm a writer and a journalist. I'm the author of the crime fiction bestseller, The Khan. I would like to start by thanking Merton Libraries and Wimbledon Library, and also for Arts Council England for their support for making this event possible. The event is a new partnership with the Lahore Literary Festival, which is about sharing stories which put a spotlight on South Asia. And I think some of you might have been at the Architecture and Islam event, which was going on. Today, I will be in conversation with Mohsin Hamid via Zoom. Mohsin's book, The Last White Man, was chosen as the festival's first big read title, with 500 copies given away to the community and available to borrow from libraries this summer. He is also the author of The Reluctant Fundamentalist, Exit West, and is someone with whom I have a quite vicarious kind of connection. He doesn't know this yet, but hopefully I will be taking you through that in our conversation. We will then have some questions at the end where I'll ask you to come to the mic, because we've got a camera set up there and we'd like Mohsin to be able to see you as you ask your questions. So without further ado, let me introduce Mohsin Hamid. Hi Mohsin, can you hear me and see me?
Hi, yes, I can hear you.
Where are you today? Where are you joining us from?
I'm in my study in Lahore, Pakistan. This is where my procrastination mainly happens.
Thank you for joining us here. We've got quite a nice audience here, a nice big audience, should I say, who are here to hear you talk about your work. And I was just saying that you and I are connected, and you don't know this, how we are connected, but there's two reasons. One is that I'm married because of you, because when I met my husband, the first time he came to see me, he bought me a copy of your book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist. So I'd like to think that's what clinched it. He had good taste in writing. And the second reason that you and I are connected is because I heard you speak at the South Bank Centre in London, and you talked about your book, Exit West, and that it doesn't mention a location, which I thought was fascinating, because I'd read the entire book, and that the brilliance of the writing, it hadn't occurred to me that there wasn't a location mentioned. And I went away and I took every reference to location out of my book, a book that I hadn't been able to sell for 7 years, and then managed to sell it. So I'm here for multiple reasons because of you.
Wonderful.
I was wondering if we could start with you reading an excerpt from The Last White Man, please.
Sure. Hello, everyone. This is going to be from the very beginning of the book. Just the first couple of pages. This is how it starts. One morning, Anders, a white man, woke up to find he had turned a deep and undeniable brown. This dawned upon him gradually, and then suddenly. First as a sense, as he reached for his phone, that the early light was doing something strange to the color of his forearm. Subsequently, and with a start, as a momentary conviction that there was somebody else in bed with him, male, darker. But this, terrifying though it was surely impossible, and he was reassured that the other moved as he moved, was in fact not a person, not a separate person, but was just him, Anders, causing a wave of relief. For if the idea that someone else was there was only imagined, then of course the notion that he had changed color was a trick too, an optical illusion or a mental artifact, born in the slippery halfway place between dreams and wakefulness. Except that by now he had his phone in his hands, and he had reversed the camera, and he saw that the face looking back at him was not his at all. Anders scrambled out of his bed and began to rush to his bathroom. But, calming himself, he forced his gait to slow, to become more deliberate, measured, and whether he did this to assert his control over the situation, to compel reality to return through sheer strength of mind, or because running would have frightened him more, made him forever into prey being pursued, he did not know. The bathroom was shabbily but comfortingly familiar. The cracks in the tiles, the dirt in the grouting, the streak of dried toothpaste drip on the outside of the sink. The interior of the medicine cabinet was visible, the mirror door askew, and Anders raised his hand and swung his reflection into place before his eyes. It was not that of an Anders he recognized. He was overtaken by emotion, not so much shock or sorrow, though those things were there too, but above all, the face replacing his filled him with anger, or rather, more than anger, an unexpected, murderous rage. He wanted to kill the colored man who confronted him here in his home, to extinguish the life animating this other's body, to leave nothing standing but himself, as he was before. And he slammed the side of his fist into the face, cracking it slightly, and causing the whole fitting, cabinet, mirror, and all, to skew, like a painting after an earthquake has passed. Anders stood, the pain in his hand muted by the intensity that had seized him, and he felt himself trembling, a vibration so faint as barely to be perceptible, but then stronger, like a dangerous winter chill, like freezing outdoors, unsheltered, and it drove him back to his bed and under his sheets, and he lay there for a long while, hiding, willing this day, just begun, please, please, not to begin.
Thank you. I don't know if you can hear, but the audience is applauding at
Oh,
your
great.
writing. So it's hit a note. It sounds fascinating. And having read your background, I understand that you are born in Pakistan, is that right? You've lived in the US and you've lived in the UK. And I am intrigued to know and interested to know how those three places have influenced your work, and indeed if they have influenced your work.
I think, we're all shaped by where we spend our lives and how we live our lives. And in my case, I have a thoroughly sort of mongrelized, hybridized sort of identity. I was born in Lahore, went to America at the age of 3. My father was doing his PhD in California. We lived there till I was 9. Came back to Pakistan, had to relearn Urdu, which I'd completely forgotten. I once was a Pakistani kid who became an American kid, and then I was at 9 an American kid who had to become a Pakistani kid. And then at 18 went back to America to study, stayed there for about a decade, more than a decade. Went to university, law school, worked in New York, tossed up in London the summer before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, 2001. And spent the first decade of the new millennium in London and have been largely in Lahore for the past decade and a bit, but with very frequent stints in London and New York, which are, I guess, my other two main homes outside of Pakistan. So as a result of all of that, I suppose I feel at home in at least 3 different countries. But I also feel somewhat foreign everywhere. And I think the idea of many of my novels is about people who feel that sense of sort of belonging and not belonging, of being of something and not of something. And certainly this novel is very much about that.
As somebody who was born in London but is of Pakistani heritage, I can relate to that really strongly. And I feel like most people on some level, even if they live and remain in a country, feel that sense of not being part of something. Is that something that you tap into? And is that the universal appeal of your work, do you think?
Well, I think I, as a child, learned very early that I sort of needed to be a kind of chameleon, or I thought I needed to be a kind of chameleon, that I should not stand out. I should sound like an American in America and like a Pakistani kid in Pakistan. And I felt I was different and I should not appear to be different. And as I got older, I began to realize that, maybe I didn't need to do that so much. That in fact, maybe it's not that I'm different, it's just that I'm aware of this feeling of difference. And everybody else sort of feels it too, but just doesn't acknowledge it fully within themselves. And the most obvious way in which this happens, of course, is with time. So a lot of my work is about migration. And I think one of the lesser noticed aspects of migration is the way that a human life is a migration through time. So you could have been born in Wimbledon, let's say 70 years ago, in 1953, and have lived in the same house on the same street for the last 70 years, have never migrated geographically, but still find that you inhabit today a neighborhood, a city, a country that has come to feel somewhat foreign, where you feel somewhat foreign. And I think just that experience of getting older is to become a little bit of a foreigner in the world. You know, we were all at one point the children of the world, or the teenagers of the world, or the young people with the hip clothing and cool music of the world. I'm, 52 now, and none of those statements really apply to me anymore. And so I think that aspect of human beings as being migrants through time is something that I've come to think of as a kind of human universal, and is a key that one can try to turn to unlock connections that we otherwise might not imagine exist. We might think that the person, who is frightened of immigrants to their city or their country is themselves not an immigrant. But it may be that deep down they too feel like an immigrant, but they feel like an immigrant to the year 2023 from the 1950s or 1960s or 1970s. And a lot of my work in a way is about that, about breaking down these binaries of thinking about, who is native and who is foreign, or who is brown and who is white, and trying to access sort of a common humanity that lurks, within each of us.
Your work is so diverse and different to the stereotype, which is something I've always loved about it, especially as someone who grew up without seeing many Pakistani writers in English on the bookshelves. So it was great when I read The Reluctant Fundamentalist. And before I go on to talk to you more about your work, I want to ask you about Pakistan, because it's very rare that I get to speak to and interview a Pakistani writer. And I feel as if the impression of Pakistan in the UK is very different to my experiences of Pakistan. So I want to ask you about what your Pakistan is like to you, where you live, what it's like, rather than the gritty kind of squalid streets that we always see in stereotypes, if that's okay.
Yeah, it's funny how due to social media and news and just a internet-connected world, we are offered up these slices of different places. I remember in April, I was going to Paris on a book tour for the French translation of The Last White Man. And there were reputedly these riots and, unrest, and my mother, messaged me as I was boarding my flight and said, be safe and be careful, and things in Paris look very bad. And she was messaging from Pakistan. And I said, look, I suspect that Paris is probably okay. I think it'll be all right. And I got to Paris, and of course there were protests, and there were riots, and there is all sorts of things happening in Paris. But that said, the first day I got in, I went for a 3-hour walk around the city, the sort of central parts of the city near my hotel, I suppose, but a long 3-hour walk through many miles of central Paris. And it looked more or less like it typically looks. And so the same, I think, happens to Pakistan, which is to say that, outside the reports are of, this disaster and that disaster. And of course, there are disasters. There's the disasters of terrorism and, political unrest and economic problems, the incredible and destructive floods of last year. These things are there and they happen. And they're not insignificant. They're hugely significant. I think there's a real feeling of depression in Pakistan today. So many people I speak to feel really anxious about the future. But the funny thing is that when I go to New York or London or Paris, or a small town in the Philippines or Brazil, people are talking about the same things. They too are feeling anxious and worried about the future. This depression, this malaise seems to be a global phenomenon. And so, the Lahore that I live in is a Lahore where my children, go to school. And my daughter was a candidate in her student council election yesterday. And my son is on his way home from his football class. And, my friends are architects and singers and professionals, and they live lives that, would be very recognizable to somebody sitting in Wimbledon. And now, which is not to say that, Lahore and Wimbledon are the same or whatever, but I think that Lahore and London are much more similar, for example, than Lahore and a village a few hours drive from Lahore would be. The way that our world works now is that we imagine that we're very different because we live in different countries, and in part we are. But there are other divisions between urban and rural, rich and poor, which are even more powerful. So, my life in Lahore is an urban life that would not be so unfamiliar to somebody in London, I think.
That's exactly what I wanted you to say. My memories of Pakistan, because my grandmother is from Karachi, or was from Karachi, is very much the wood I can see on the back of your bookcase, lined with old newspapers, and old Urdu newspapers, and the smell of it, and a place that was very safe to me, because as a child, I was protected. And maybe it was a very different Pakistan. We would go to the shops by ourselves, we'd be allowed to go. And a place that was full of art and music and poetry. I mean, it was such a big part, the cultural time during the kind of 80s and 90s, when pop music was developing as well in Pakistan, which was really fascinating. I think you and I are about the same age, so we probably experienced it in similar ways, kind of. And that's what it is to me. And I really feel that reading your books as well. It is a Pakistan that I know, even though maybe Pakistan isn't mentioned in there, I think, because of your name on the top of the book. So it's fascinating. I want to ask you about your process, where your stories come from, when they come to you, and how you go about putting them on paper.
So process sounds, so efficient. I tend to take between 4 and 7 years to write, each of my quite short novels. So I wouldn't say that efficiency is the first characteristic that would come to mind when I think about how I write. Most of the time, I'm, as I said before, procrastinating or just sort of stuck, trying something which doesn't work, trying to figure something out. Douglas Adams, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series of novels, at one point writes that the secret to flying is throwing yourself at the ground and missing. And that has long been my approach to writing, which is that, you try to write something that doesn't work.
I think that's my approach to life as well. I think
Yes.
there's a lot of bruises here.
You keep smacking into the ground, and then one day, one of your drafts doesn't smack into the ground, and you find that it's flying. But when I tell students, I often speak to students at different places, including in Pakistan, about writing, and I will tell them that for me, writing a novel is much more like digging a well than it is like climbing a mountain. Climbing a mountain, you assume that you can see this peak in the distance. And it's just a matter of sort of gathering your courage and your grit and making your way to the base camp, and then step by step ascending to that summit, and you can look out at the world. But I find it doesn't work like that for me. I would say it's much more like digging a well, because what one does when one writes a novel, at least what I do, is you create this void. A well is basically a hole in the ground. And almost miraculously, water seeps out of the ground into that hole, and it makes it into a well. And something similar happens when you write. What I do is I make a few hours in the day that are a void, where I don't do anything else, where I sit there and try to write. And sometimes I don't successfully write anything. But there's some hours of the day which are just kept open, a hole in time. And over the course of a few years, that hole fills with water, and that water becomes the novel. So I think writing for me is much more about making a stretch of time empty every day, with only writing as my activity in that time. And then as those hours accumulate across months and years, that time reconfigures itself into a novel.
It's a great act of faith and courage to write a book. And it sounds like that for you as well. I find it that way, but with my first one, I had a stretch of time. With the second one, there was a deadline. So are you writing without deadlines with these?
Yes.
You are? Okay.
Yeah, I've been writing without deadlines. I do something, I guess, which is a little bit peculiar, which is that I tend not to sell my novels until I've written them.
Yes.
So I try to avoid, entering into a contract.
Is that a
for the
conscious
novel.
choice on your part?
It is a conscious choice, and this is despite the fact that I've had the same publishers pretty much my entire career. So in the U.S., my editor Becky Salatan has been my editor since 1998. I've never changed. I have the same agent, and in the U.K., Simon Prosser, who's my editor at Hamish Hamilton, has been my editor, since The Rotten Fundamentalist, since my second novel. So for best part of 17 years since he acquired that book. So it's not that I'm sort of holding back on selling the novel because I want to have some sort of auction and get the best price for it. I've actually never had an auction. I sort of just wind up giving it back to the same publishers. It's rather because I feel like I want to hand it in when I feel it's done. And also I want to feel that it is my choice as to what the novel is. And so since there's no real contract binding us until the editor has read it and in theory likes it and wants to publish it more or less as it is, of course there will be edits and feedback, but at that point it will both be agreed that this is the project and everybody's happy. It sort of gets around this question of, it's due on such and such day, or perhaps you could change this or that or the other. That gets avoided. So I've, I guess, done that has been my approach to not share the novel or not, I suppose, sell the novel, and therefore to not face a deadline. The negative part of that, of course, is that I probably take a lot longer writing my books than I should. When I was writing The Rotten Fundamentalist, I handed in this tiny manuscript about 7 years after starting it, and my agent called me the reluctant novelist because I'd produced this tiny, piece of writing after 7 years. So I could be maybe more efficient if I did what you've said, which is having a deadline. But I don't do that.
Every 7 years sounds like a long time. I mean, it's obviously
I hope
slightly
not
less than
anymore.
that because it's not. You've
Yeah.
written. I mean, you're massively successful. I was looking at the list of awards. I mean, I was going to write them down, but they were endless. But I want to ask you, which is your favorite? Which was the favorite one that you were up for? Or the most surprising one, maybe?
Well, I've certainly been shortlisted for and not won many more awards than I have. There was a stretch with the Rotten with Exit West, where there was, I think about 10 in a row that were shortlisted and yet not won by me. My daughter, as I said, was standing in a student council election in her school. And I gave her my example of, look, I know tomorrow they're going to announce in the assembly whether you won the election or you didn't win the election. And of course, all the attention will be on you, and you're going to have to muster the grace to sort of smile as you lose if you happen to lose. But don't worry. I've done that lots of times, and I told her about the 2 Booker Prize ceremonies where I had lost. And there's TV cameras and a big deal. I tend to be, quite happy just to be there. So I've never felt particularly disappointed not to win a prize. I think it's wonderful even to be shortlisted for a prize. And also I think, prizes are slightly silly, of course, in the sense that, there's no such thing as the best book. It's not like the sort of 100-meter dash, where you can say this guy clocked in at 9:83 and you're 9:89. I think the function of prizes is that they draw the attention of readers to books. And that's wonderful. And I'm glad they exist. I'm glad they do that. I don't take them too seriously. All of that said, if I were to say, what have been some of the prizes that I have, most valued, one of them, there was this prize in Italy named after this wonderful Italian journalist, Tiziano Terzani. And I was invited to share that prize with an Italian writer in the small town of Udine in northeastern Italy. And, it was offered, by the commune of this small town in a province in Italy. And there was something so, I could, sort of intimate and almost familial about that prize. Sometimes it's the smallest prizes where you go and you just meet these people who sort of have a passion for what they're doing, and you get to be part of their, I guess, publishing or literary family for a week. Those are often the most intimate and wonderful experiences because they're completely unexpected. I never thought I'd be in Italy getting some prize.
Did you ever think that your novel would be made into a Hollywood film? And when it was, how was that for you?
Being a fantasist who's lived much of his life in his imagination, I can't say that I had never imagined a film being made of my work. I think I probably daydreamed of it happening. Still, I was, it was interesting when Mira and I called me. She was in London and said, look, I'd love to meet you for lunch and talk about this book. And I loved Salam Bombay and Mohsin Wedding and a number of her works. And we just hit it off really, really well. She's Punjabi and her family ancestrally is partly from Lahore. And she's been to the city many times. And we both had a real, I guess, strong commitment to the idea that, Indians and Pakistanis should make art together. That these, the animosity between India and Pakistan is a completely ridiculous and horrific thing. And why not do something that was the opposite of that? And so the process of making that film was really a coming together of many different people, an Indian director, Pakistani novelist, but also, for example, Riz Ahmed, who was, the star of that film, a British Pakistani actor and, wonderful actor. And I think for me, I was very, intrigued and enthused by the process of making the film, even though the film was very different from the book, as I suppose it has to be. But, in Rotten Fundamentalist, it was Riz Ahmed starring with Kate Hudson and Kiefer Sutherland and Liev Schreiber, Om Puri, Shabana Azmi. But up until that time, if you'd had a film with, Riz Ahmed, Kiefer Sutherland and Liev Schreiber and Kate Hudson, the Riz Ahmed character typically would be dead about 30 minutes into that film. And so this was a very interesting film because you had, Riz was the lead. And all of these big name Hollywood actors, in a sense, had agreed to be supporting cast to Riz's performance. And so in many ways, I think just the form of the film and how it got made was reflected a kind of worldview that I have, which is really of this coming together, of people from all over the world. Hundreds of people are involved in making a film. And it's the opposite of writing a novel where you sit all by yourself in a room. So I really enjoyed the experience.
So we make art because we're compelled to make art, but you've managed to do something which has actually changed the landscape for people, as you've just mentioned, with filmmakers and bringing together India and Pakistan. You definitely did that for me, as I've already explained. Is that something you ever aspired to do, or do you just sit in your room and just write your little story?
No, I mean, I'm so happy to hear you say that. I mean, as you know, for all of us who write books, there's certainly many occasions in a month or a year or even a day where you ask, what is the point of doing this? And what am I, what's going on? Like, why am I actually spending my life doing this thing?
I can relate to that totally. It's painful.
Yeah.
And I think people think that we sit there just drinking tea and writing, but the amount of, hair pulling that goes on, and why am I doing this? And why did I not listen to my parents and get a proper job? It's fascinating.
And it's not just that there are questions over, how much are books read, and how does one make a living, and these sorts of things. I mean, that arises in many other professions. Issues of, to what impact am I having, or how would I make a living? That's something which occurs in many, many different professions. But what's unusual about writing books is the choice that one makes to spend so much of one's life alone in one's own head. And it adds up. Now that I've written 5 novels and a book of essays, so I guess 6 books, a lot of years have been spent sitting by myself. And that is a harder question, where one, starts to think, was that worth it? Is it worth it? But I suppose in my case, what winds up happening is when I don't do it, I start to become very, uncomfortable.
Yes.
I'm not entirely comfortable with the way the world is. And so the same way that my son, will pretend being a kung fu master or Tyrannosaurus Rex because he doesn't want to be, a little boy at that particular moment. I suppose I write novels because I don't want to live in the world the way it is all the time. I sometimes want to go someplace else, an imaginary place. And I think for many of us, the tyranny of reality is just a bit overpowering. So having a few hours of the day where you can go someplace else and make a universe in your own imagination becomes sort of tempting and necessary.
You mentioned that there are other places where we talk about finances and whether books can help make a living. Do you do anything else other than write? I understand. Are you a storyteller for?
I've done different things. So I went to law school. I didn't practice law. I worked as a management consultant in New York, and then I was in a consulting firm in London, and I've done some part-time consulting and whatever. I'd say, since The Reluctant Fundamentalist, the vast majority of what I've done is write books. And to the extent that I do other sorts of work, it's typically not paid. So, I'm involved in helping to set up the Lahore Biennale and the Lahore Literary Festival. I teach on a volunteer basis at a local university. So I do other things that get me out of the house and have me interact with people and sort of be part of the world. But the vast majority of my, you could say, gainful employment is as a writer. There have been snippets of other things on the side, but really, since The Reluctant Fundamentalist, I've been able to do it, more or less full time. The other thing, of course, is that living in Pakistan, that's much easier to do. So, my friends who live in New York, who are writers, even some of the very, very famous writers that everyone has heard of, teach, because New York is just so incredibly expensive. And I think that I sometimes tell people that, living in Pakistan is my, teaching job. In other words, it's just much less expensive to live in Lahore than it is to live in London or New York. And it's another thing which is interesting because, people will talk about how, how can you live in Pakistan and there's, so many constraints on freedom of expression. And that's true. There are constraints. But on the other hand, there are real opportunities as well. And one of those opportunities, of course, is that, one can be involved in so many different things, in the arts generally, in volunteer work, in all sorts of things. I was telling a friend of mine the other day, my children, go to private school, sort of fee-paying schools in Lahore, and I think very good schools. But the fees of schools in Lahore are infinitely small compared to what one pays in London. So things like that, in a sense, a lot of people I know in Pakistan occupy funny sorts of niches and pursue sorts of practices, whether they're architects or singers or artists or writers, that might not be financially viable for them, actually, in a city like London or New York. And there's an incredibly vibrant artistic scene here, as there often is in places that are less expensive, which is why cities like Berlin, for example, flourished, so much in the arts, because it was just a reasonably priced place to live. So I think, for me, the bulk of what I do, I guess, is writing, is in terms of how do I make a living.
We're going to come to questions in a minute, but I want to ask you about The Last White Man, because that's why we're here. This is the big read for the Wimbledon BookFest. It's such a fascinating premise. Where did it come from?
So in The Last White Man, a young man named Anders wakes up and he's dark. And this predicament begins to spread. And it causes all sorts of anxiety for Anders, but also for the community around him and for the world. And things wind up getting very, very unsettled. Now, partly I think it came from a feeling that there is this rising sense of kind of racial anxiety in so many places. I lived in New York before 9/11, and then witnessed, I suppose, the spike in Islamophobia from a distance. I lived in London before Brexit, and then witnessed sort of this rise of a kind of nationalism, from a distance. But it's happening not just in the US and UK. I mean, it's happening in Pakistan and India and Brazil and Philippines and Turkey, Russia, where you have these sort of populist figures who are either the leader of the country or the leader of the opposition, who are saying that, we are the true people and we must stand up for the true people, etc. So there's something about that, this feeling that the true people everywhere are being erased, coupled with the personal experience that I had myself, which was, I remember, living in London in September of 2001. And having lived in the West at that point, since 1989, when I came to America for college. And for most of that time, not encountering too much in the way of overt racism or racist, I guess, to the extent that I was aware of racism and I had sort of my share of minor problems, but, I had a well-paying job, I had a flat in the center of the city, I could do what I please, I could date, whoever I wanted, etc. So I thought, sure, it was an annoyance, but it wasn't something that was intruding too heavily into my personal life. Although I was aware that, of course, for many other people, it was intruding incredibly heavily, and sometimes lethally, but it was still not so intimate. And then after 9/11, being sort of pulled aside at every airport and questioned for hours, and, once being taken off an aircraft that was already on the runway and taken back in to be researched. And, I realized that I hadn't changed. But suddenly the way that people were looking at me had changed. And so, in a sense, I was not unlike Anders. Not that I had been white, but I had sort of participated in many of the benefits of whiteness. If being white in a place like London or New York is just to be a human being, then in my case, given my education, given the job that I had, given the income that I had from that job, I was sort of, existing in a world where many of the benefits of whiteness also applied to me. And then suddenly I was finding myself, profiled and questioned. And I thought, at first I thought I hope things go back to the way they were. Like, I don't like this. This is, I want to go back to how it was before. And then I suppose I thought more about it, and I thought, wait, it was perhaps, a kind of blindness on my part. that had caused me not to see that this was going on, to be aware that it was going on, but because it didn't affect me particularly, to sort of downplay the importance of this sort of systemic problem. And now, instead of wanting things to go back to how they were before, where I could be blind again, I should perhaps be grateful for the fact that my eyes have been opened, and to see how I look at the world differently. And so, in a sense, the journey that Anders goes on is not dissimilar from that. In the novel, he too experiences the loss of a kind of belonging and the loss of a kind of status and the sort of being suspect. But he also, in a sense, goes through a journey where his own humanity becomes clearer to himself. And in that sense, the novel, I think, flows from a very personal place, even though it's a novel where all of the main characters are white.
I'm sure many of you have lots of questions because it's such a fascinating novel and such a fascinating concept. Can I ask if anyone would like to go first? Is there anyone who's going to... fantastic. Would you be able to come up to the mic, please? Just over here. Thank you. And while you're doing that, Mohsin, I'm going to ask you one last question, which is, you think about some really deep, interesting things. Are you a happy writer? Are you happy?
I don't know. I mean, that's a tough one. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
I think I feel fairly sensitive to the political wind. I think, having lived all over the place, it's like if you change schools a lot when you're young. If you change schools a lot when you're young, you learn to read the room because you have to.
You've
Each time you
stretched
show up in a
yourself.
new classroom. Yeah, each time you come into a new classroom, you're in a new school in 6th or 5th or 4th grade or the UK equivalent, you have to, how are the kids looking at me? What's the vibe? What's going on here? You have to figure it out each time. And since I've done a lot of moving around, I suppose I'm very sensitive to those sorts of things and to the political wind. And at the moment, it feels like quite an ill wind indeed. The political wind all over the world feels quite horrifying. So I have to say it's a little difficult for me to characterize my current state as all that happy. But I'm trying. And I think one thing which is very important is it is important to try to find one's way to a certain kind of optimism, because in the absence of optimism, we tend to all be gripped by nostalgia.
Yeah.
And then to be easily seduced by sort of figures who are peddling nostalgic political visions. And so I think finding our way to optimism, a sort of cautious, critical optimism, is very important. But I would be lying if I said I was, particularly happy with the world at the moment, or even in the world at the moment.
I've called a lady up and I've had her waiting for a long time. Can I ask your name and what's your question,
Hi.
please?
My name is Iram, and Assalamu alaikum. I'm also from Karachi, but I live here in Mitcham. I'll just have a little introduction. Thank you, Simon Mohsin. I met you a couple of years ago with Hamid Haroon here in London. And obviously, I've read your books from Motsmog, and I've read 3 books, I'll be honest, not all of them. But I just have a little, I'm a journalist as well. I've worked with BBC for the last 11 years, so I know how it is, what to write, how to engage. And obviously, we play around the words in our own little imaginary world. I also teach. I'm a professor. I just wanted to know that how can your books or your writing attract the generation of today, which is the generation, or the Z, we call them the Gen Z, but lots of students, they don't read books anymore. Maybe, we just have a certain category that we target. Looking here, I seem to be the youngest right now, but I'm just like, just how can we bring back the younger generation, or the generation of today, to read something that you write? Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great question. I mean, Walaikum Salam, first of all. And, I suppose there's a couple of questions there. One is, what about young people and reading? And while it's true that young people are, I think, so deeply enmeshed in the battle for their attention, and the screens that they hold in their hand make such enormous claims on their attention and sort of are seductive. And in that sense, the novel is a very strange thing in the, early mid 21st century, which is, it's a thing that you sort of look at for hours at a time. It doesn't particularly, hyperlink to anything else or flash any video or do anything like that. It just sort of sits there, this wood and ink. But I think what the novel does, which is quite spectacular, is, it encourages people to sit there, holding this pulped wood and ink in their hands and hallucinate vividly for hours. That's what reading is. You're just sitting there having this hallucination. Now, the hallucination is inspired by some prompts from the writer in the form of these letters and punctuation marks and spaces. But it's very substantially originating from the reader. The reader is creating this hallucination in response to the artifact produced by the writer. I suspect that the appetite for hallucinating in this way will endure. What's interesting, though, is, what can we do as writers to cut through the battle for attention and still reach young people who aren't used to spending hours and hours, in a sustained attentional relationship with something that demands that they make something? Because so much of what they are engaged with is made for them. It already looks like the world. You just have to sit there and absorb it. Whereas with a book, you have to make it yourself. And I think that raises certain formal questions. How should we write novels in this time? What moves can a writer make in this time to open up books to readers? And perhaps there are different kinds of formal moves and different kinds of approaches to language that are called for. But I think young people still do read. It has never been everybody, that has read novels. And maybe people don't read very many novels. But I don't know if the novel is going to win the game of scale. But in terms of its profound relationship to another human being, I think it still does remain quite unique. And I guess partly what I'm interested in is playing with the form of the thing. So some examples of this is I've increasingly tried to write short books because time feels like such a constrained thing. I've increasingly, I guess, written books that haven't had dialogue because, dialogue and visual description is so much already done for us in television and film. I've written books that have sort of empty space so that you can imagine them yourselves. So in a way, I'm reacting, I guess, to these trends. Whether what I'm doing is sufficient, I think it probably almost certainly isn't. But I think, writers will figure this out and readers will figure it out. And so I don't despair. And certainly I meet lots of young people who do read my books. But perhaps they will read the books of people younger than me with much more enthusiasm.
That's fascinating. Anyone else have a question? Yes, would you like to come to the front, please? Yes, the lady in the green top. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for today. My name is Camilla. I don't often read a book more than once, so thank you very much for The Reluctant Fundamentalist. It's really a fantastic book. My question to you is your style of writing and your use of English language and the economy of words that you choose. And look at the books that you've written, as we've touched on today, it's not necessarily about, it's different themes, but you play with words and you play with English and you play with language. Can you tell us a bit about that journey that you explore and the enjoyment you get out of the English language?
English is by far my best language. So I learned English when I was 3, and I forgot Urdu. So although English is my second language, it's my best language. And Urdu, which I relearned when I was 9, it was my first language, but it really isn't anymore. It's more my third language. So I have a second language is English, a first language which I've lost, which was my native Urdu of a 3-year-old, and then a third language, which is the Urdu I relearned as a 10, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-old, which is nowhere near good enough to write novels in or even really essays. So English is the language that I have, but because not only did I learn English second, but I learned it in different places. So I learned English in California, then I learned English in Pakistan, then I learned English in the East Coast, I learned English in London. It became apparent to me that what we call English is also this vast cosmopolitan space where people are speaking so many different Englishes and writing so many different Englishes. And so I think what I've tried to do in my novels is to very often figure out what sort of language is appropriate to the form of that particular book. In Moth Smoke, it was a very oral, spoken kind of a language. In Dutton Fundamentalist, it was a much more formal English, in part because the main character, Cengiz, isn't particularly religious, but I wanted him, through his language, to convey what might be perceived as some element of religion. And so therefore I tried to give him a manner of speaking that was sort of formal and somewhat archaic, potentially menacing, which I thought might, for certain readers, evoke a certain kind of Islam. Because, of course, there's no such thing as a Muslim voice. There's 2 billion different people. But there are certain echoes which one can tap into to provoke in the reader certain suppositions. And then I wrote How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia as a kind of self-help book that wasn't really a self-help book, but that was actually a novel, of course, in a voice that married sort of self-help language with something more elevated. In my fourth novel, when I was thinking about Exit West, I remember speaking to this nurse I'd had this hearing problem, and I went to see this audiologist, and the nurse who was setting up the equipment said she was a big reader, and she told me what she read, and it wasn't really literary fiction. It was sort of, popular type of stuff. And I remember thinking in Lahore, do I write in a way that's unnecessarily elitist? Like, do I write these novels which, don't say what they mean and create ambiguities of meaning, and the reader has to sort of piece it together? But is that perhaps an inherently elitist project? Maybe I should just write a novel that says exactly what it means, and speaks sort of clearly. And so I set out to write Exit West in a way almost inspired by children's literature, because I think children's literature very often does that. It's able to say exactly what it means and clearly, and be on the side of its characters, while also being morally sophisticated and sometimes formally very inventive. And then, for this novel, The Last White Man, there are these long kind of sentences that just keep going on and on and on. And that formal choice of using language in that way was because I thought, I would like the reader to sort of be borne along by the flow of the language, to not have places to stop and to think. So to have something happen in a sentence which is perhaps off-putting or confusing or objectionable or provocative, but to be carried along by the sentence for several more lines. And that has now sort of slipped by. And by the time the reader has a place to pause for breath, that idea has already been accepted, or perhaps not resisted in the way it might have been resisted. And in that sense, the novel partakes of, I think, a quality that orators have been aware of since the beginning of human history, which is, we can set up through cadence certain rhythms and language such that the words that follow sound musically like they are the right words. And because they sound like the right words, because the rhythm is correct and the cadence is correct, we are inherently susceptible to allowing ourselves to take their meaning on board in a way that we otherwise might not. So if you think about Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, it's not that nobody had said before the idea that, we should all be the same and there should be equality and we should have equal opportunities. It had been said many, many times. But the power of the speech was the cadence that gets established means each of the words that falls into place is like a brick falling into a wall where you know this is the right brick and this is the right brick and this is the right brick. And at the end of it, you've built the wall. And the listener has accepted the meaning of the speech in a very different way than would otherwise be the case. It's persuasive. And so this novel, which is in a sense about these very strange shifts, is written in these long, hopefully cadence-filled sentences for that reason. And lastly, it's written this way in terms of language because now language has become so performative. We tweet things and put things on social media, and then we're supposed to live and die by what we tweeted yesterday. But the truth of it is that our beliefs are fairly ephemeral. We often say things, and then 5 minutes later we think, I don't actually believe this. This is kind of a stupid thing to say. Why did I say that? I now think this. And without a kind of frozen log in the form of social media, we would be allowed to say something dumb to our friends and then next week say, actually, you know what, that didn't make any sense. That was a silly position to take. Instead of defending it to the bitter end, as we have to do now because it's sort of frozen as part of our official archive. And so the sentences in The Last White Man are full of an idea being teased out, being played with, being rejected, being modified, being teased with again, etc., etc. They are sentences that continuously qualify themselves. In a way, because I think that's more true to how human beings actually are, actually think. And in a way, because it opens up space for us to change our minds, which we do, and which we're prone to doing, unless someone pins us down in a position that we took yesterday.
Mohsin, Hamid, thank you very much. I think that's such a brilliant place to end the conversation. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you all very much for coming.
For you here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed. To find out more about Wimbledon Book Fest and what we do, head to wimbledonbookfest.org.